Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to Terraform Tuesday. I know it's your favorite day of the week, and here I am to talk about another terraformy kind of thing. And today's topic is going to be about dynamic blocks. This was a viewer question. They were curious, like, how do you use dynamic blocks? Where do you use dynamic blocks? How do you feed data into them? Those are some of the questions I want to answer, but as I started thinking more about dynamic blocks, I started realizing that I had some questions too about why am I using this thing and why does it bother me so much? Like it really gets in my craw that I have to use dynamic blocks. What is it about them that bothers me so? So I kind of got to, I dug down and figured out what bothered me about it. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about what the syntax is, how you use it, how you push data into dynamic blocks. And then I've got a couple actual examples of Azure and AWS deployments that use dynamic blocks. So that's everything that we're going to cover in this video. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be awesome. Before we get into that, I just want to let you know I am in the process of updating my Terraform study guide to include the new features that are in .14. So that's stuff like the lock file they added. They also kind of deprecated some stuff or put stuff on the deprecation table. So I'm updating the guide to not only represent what's new in .14, but also best practices when it comes to the syntax and the formatting of Terraform files, because that shifted a little bit too, especially with like the required providers. So if you're interested, if you haven't bought the guide, go out and grab it. It's down in the description. If you have bought the guide, just keep an eye out because that update will be coming and you get it as part of your purchase price. You get that update. So that's pretty cool. Aside from that, I've started working on a new course for Pluralsight, and this is going to be a Vault certification course. It's going to actually be one of 2 courses that I'm doing. So keep an eye out for that. It should be done by the end of February 2021 and then published in the beginning of March. So that'll be the first course. It's going to be a lot of the content, but not the internals of how Vault Server works, because that's going to be a separate course. But those are both part of the associate level exam. So it's going to be a certification prep course, and that's going to be on Pluralsight. So with that out of the way, let's talk about dynamic blocks. Like, why do you use them? What are they for? Well, dynamic blocks are something that you can put inside of a resource block. It can also be used inside of data blocks, I believe. And the point behind dynamic blocks is you might want to repeat multiples of the same block type. And because that is something you can do in Terraform, why not have a looping function, kind of like a for each loop or a count loop for a resource? But in this case, we're doing it just for a single block that's inside of an existing resource. So if that doesn't make sense, I'm going to give you some examples of when you would use it and why you would use it. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why it bothers me that it exists at all. And to do that, we're going to have to talk about first normal form. If that doesn't sound familiar, I'll explain it a little bit. And guess what? I've got some visuals to help explain along. So let's go ahead and bring those up. There's this concept in the world of databases called first normal form. And the basic idea is if you have a bunch of rows, each column should be atomic in nature. You shouldn't have multiple entries in a single column. If you're going to have multiple entries, you need to separate them either into separate columns or break them out into their own table. So if you look at the 2 examples that we have here, we've got a virtual network. And what's in that virtual network? Well, you've got some properties, some attributes of that virtual network. You've got the location and you've got the resource group. Okay, those are atomic and completely separate single value items. And then we've got subnets. We've got a list of subnets here. Now that technically violates first normal form. You can't have multiple values for this one column. Same thing if we were doing a network security group. We've got the name, the location, the resource group. Okay, those are all single value items and they're directly tied to the identity of this resource. And then we've got rules, multiple rules. Okay, again, that violates first normal form, which basically what that ends up doing is it ends up making first normal form very sad. This is something, it's a classic thing that you learn the first database class you've ever taken or data structure thing, you learn about this first normal form and then you file it away in the things that I don't care about, but it might be something that just kind of bothers you. This is why it's bothering you. It's because it makes it more difficult to represent this data structure. There's 2 potential things to take into account here. You could have a relationship of what's in that column to the main resource that's one to many. So a good example would be a VNet with multiple subnets. Those subnets can only belong to that one virtual network. They can't belong to others. So the relationship is one VNet to multiple subnets. If you have that situation, you can break out the subnet into its own table. If this was a database, if we're going with databases here, you could break it out in its own table and just reference the virtual network within there. And now you have a relationship between those two things. It's one to many. That's fine. You can totally do it this way. There's another way to do it as well. But that's one type of relationship. Another type of relationship is what's called many to many. So you can have many relationships between two different sets of items. So a good example here would be subnets and network security groups. A network security group can be assigned to multiple subnets, and a subnet can have multiple network security groups. At least I believe it can. Maybe it can't. Anyway, it's a many-to-many relationship. So what you do is you create this intermediary table that has the relationship of the network security group to the subnet and the VNet, and that's how you identify the subnet. But separately, the network security group exists as its own resource and the subnet exists as its own. So you have to build a third table in here, a relationship table that does the mapping between them. Okay, if that seems really esoteric and you're like, why would I even care about any of this? It's because the idea of dynamic blocks for me in my brain violates first normal form because I'm putting multiples of the same thing in a single resource. And what I should be doing is creating those resources separately and then creating a relationship between them. That's the way I would want to do it. That's the cleaner way to do it. But I understand that Terraform is doing an abstraction here, and what's actually happening on the API side could be something completely different. Okay, now that we've gotten into that, maybe now is a good time to talk about that dynamic block syntax. Okay, let's do that. Okay, here is the syntax for a dynamic block, and this would go inside, it's nested inside a resource block. This is the dynamic block here. The keyword you use is dynamic. So that lets Terraform know this is going to be a dynamic block. You're going to have to create multiples of these. What's the name of the block that you're going to be creating? That's the block name. The block name value tells it what the name of the block should be that it's repeating. And if we were doing subnets inside of VNet, that block name would be subnet. The next thing is for each. So for each defines the thing that you're going to iterate against. And this could be a list, it could be a map, or it could be a set. So you have three options here on what type of object you're passing in to iterate across. Optionally, you can give it an iterator name. So this is the thing that the name you're going to use to reference as you iterate across this. If you don't give that, if that's an optional argument, that is an optional argument. Instead, you can use the block name to iterate against instead. So it's really up to you. If you wanted to use a shorter name than whatever the block name is, you can do that. You can just use a single letter like I or S, but that's what that's for. And then lastly, if we get down to content here, in content, this is what the actual entries should be inside that block. So you have the key, whatever the key is in that block, and then equals whatever the value you want. And you can reference the iterator to get values that are stored inside the iterator. If it's a map or if it's a list, you can directly reference that list. So before we dive into that, let's go over to an actual example of one and kind of get a flavor for how it works. And then we can come back and understand better these different data structure types you would pass in the for each. Okay. All right, here we are in Visual Studio Code. And just a quick reminder, these files are always available on my GitHub repository. The link should be popping up right about now. And I've taken care to actually rename most of the folders so it's easier to find what we're looking for. This one is called Dynamic Blocks. So I still have the date in there so you know when it happened, but Dynamic Blocks is what we're talking about here. And we've got two folders in here. One is our example that's going to use AWS, and the other one uses network security groups in Microsoft Azure. Okay, so let's look at the Azure one first. Let's expand this out. And we've got two versions of the same configuration. One uses dynamic blocks and one doesn't. So let's compare. Let's start with dynamic blocks. This is the configuration for our dynamic blocks. And basically this creates a virtual network and some network security groups. And it's going to do that based off of some information that's stored in JSON. So in JSON, I've got rules, network security group rules that I want to add to a network security group. And basically, I've got a list here. So we've got our little list bracket that lets you know this is a list. And then within that list, I have map entries, object entries that are just key value pairs for each network security group rule. So that's what's in the JSON. And if you haven't watched my video about parsing JSON with Terraform, you should definitely check that one out, because that'll help you with this. Going back to this main, let's scroll down to where we're actually creating our first thing. We're going to create subnets with a dynamic block. Here we go. Here it is. This is what we're doing. There's the dynamic keyword. Now the blocks that we're creating are called subnet. And for each, we're going to pass it a map. But I don't have a map. I have a list of subnet names and I have a list of subnet prefixes. If we scroll up into the variables, here's my list of subnet prefixes, and here's my list of subnet names. Now they need to line up. You need to have the same number of each, but let's not worry about that just yet. Instead, let's scroll down here and look at what's in this dynamic loop. So we're setting our for each. We're using the zip map function to take these two lists. The keys in the map are going to be my subnet names, and the values in my map are going to be the subnet prefixes. Awesome. Now we have our content block that defines what should go into each of these subnet blocks that are going to be created. The content, the name, is going to be subnet.key. So we're referencing the key from the item that we're iterating over. And then for the address prefix, we're going to use subnet.value. So that references the value that lines up with the key of the map that we're currently working through. Might sound a little confusing, but that's essentially what we're doing here. Now, if we scroll down, we can look at how we do this with a security rule. So below this, I'm creating a network security group. I give it a name, location, resource group, all that kind of good stuff. And now I have a dynamic block to define security rules inside my network security group. So I have my for each, and for that, I'm pointing to a local variable called rules. What's in that? Let's scroll up to my local variable. Rules is equal to the JSON decode. So I'm getting the contents of the file rules.json, and I'm looking at the values stored in rules. Awesome. Okay, scrolling back down here, that's where I'm getting my content. And then I define how I'm going to extract that content. So you think about it, I've got a list here. Rules is actually a list of rules. So I need to reference values inside of that list. So as I iterate across my list, let's just start with the first one. For the name, I'm going to use security rule. That's my iterator because I didn't specify an optional iterator value. Dot value, that's the value of the list item that I'm currently working on. And because that is a map object inside that list, I can invoke the value stored in there by giving the key name. In this case, it's called name. So that's how I get the name of the security rule. And then I just repeat that for most of the settings. However, you note down in source address prefix, I'm doing something interesting here. I'm actually getting the value from my source address prefix that I have in my security rule value. Let's go over and look at what that looks like. So source address prefix is set to private. Huh, that's interesting. Well, that's because maybe I want this rule to only apply to a private connection. Okay, so I need to dynamically figure out what that value is. Coming back here, I've got a local value called rule mapping. That's a map. And if we scroll up to what that bad boy is, the rule mapping says if it's equal to private, I want you to get the public IP address of where I am and use that value. If it's set to VNet, I want you to use the address space of my VNet. If it's subnet, I want you to use the address space of my first subnet. If it's all, use star. So that's how it gets those values in here. So you can see, not only can you pull values out of the list, you can also use the value in the list to look up another value that you stored somewhere else. So we're getting into some like complex and interesting stuff here, but it's very cool how it works. And for more on that, let's jump back to the presentation and let me show you a few things about how that works. Like I said, there's 3 different object types you can pass in the for each for dynamic blocks. You can do a map, you can do a list, or you can do a set. If you use map and use the dot key to refer to something, you're referring to the key in the map. And if you use value, you're referring to the value in that map. If you're using a list type, the .key refers to the index of the item. So if you have 10 items, it's going to go 0 through 9 as it loops through. The value will be the value of the item that it's currently on. Likewise, and we just saw that when we were going through the process of iterating across my network rules. Finally, if you pass it a set, because sets are unordered, the key and the value will actually both be the same thing. They'll both be value of an item. To put it in a little more perspective, let's say I have a map called my map, and it has 3 key value pairs in it. If we loop through it and we have 3 loop iterations, the key will be in the first one, enchilada, and the value will be good. And it'll just keep going through those values. The value could be a complex value. In this case, it's just a string, but you could have a much more complex value in there if you wanted. It all depends on how you want to structure your data. So as you can see, we iterate through the loop and it'll just hit each of the key value pairs. If we have a list of 3 items, when we start our loop, our key will be set to 0 and our value will be set to whatever the value is in that list at 0. And as we go through the loop, the key will advance by 1 and the value will be whatever current item we're on in that list. For a set, the set is technically unordered, so you don't know what order these values are going to come in. So as it loops through, the key and the value are going to be the same, but there is no guarantee that what you're going to get out of this will be the same order every time. So just kind of like bear that in mind. That's an important piece of information for you to know. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and walk through how you could do this without dynamic blocks, because I think that's important and it's illustrative of this normal form thing that I was talking about. All right, back in Visual Studio Code, like I said, I've got this dynamic set up and you can run through it and deploy it. It deploys no problem. But I also have this other one called linked. And let's scroll down and see how this is a little bit different than what we decided to do with the nested or the dynamic blocks. So if we scroll down in our VNet, instead of creating all the subnets inside the VNet, instead there's a separate resource called Azure RM Subnet. And we can use a count to count through all the subnets we have and create each subnet. Now within that, we associate it with a specific virtual network. So the subnets don't live by themselves. They have a relationship with the virtual network and they actually can't exist without it. That's a required value. So there's no joiner here. It's just the two. Scrolling down a little bit more, we have a network security group. And instead of having a dynamic block in there, instead we're going to have a separate Azure Network Security Rule resource, and we're going to use the for each argument to iterate across that same JSON data, but instead we're creating the network security rules separately, and as part of the creation, we're referencing which network security group they should be a part of. The important thing to understand is that for both subnets and network security group rules, you can either specify them as blocks inside the resource, or you can have a separate resource, but you can't mix and match. You can't do both. It's not allowed for whatever reason. So depending on which approach makes more sense to you, I like this approach better. I think it's cleaner to do it this way. I wanted to give one more example of when you might use a dynamic block that's totally unrelated, but I came across it when I was doing my Terraform deep dive course for Pluralsight. I was creating an autoscale group. One of the things about autoscale groups that you need to know is it creates EC2 instances, and those EC2 instances may or may not inherit the tags that you've applied to your autoscale group. So if we scroll down here, I have some common tags that I'm defining in the locals value. Scrolling down some more, if we look in the autoscale group properties, that would be here, we can see there's a dynamic block for the tags. Why do I need that? Well, the reason I needed that is because I'm going to take the list of common tags, and as part of the content, one of the additional values that's included in the autoscale group is whether or not it should propagate that tag at launch to the EC2 instances. And you have to set that as true or false for each tag that you add. Now, because I don't have that for my general tags, the easiest way to do that is by creating multiple tag entries with a dynamic block. So that's what I had to do here. It's not the prettiest thing. Again, it doesn't make me happy, but it is something that I had to do. So just so you know, I generally don't love dynamic blocks. I don't think it's the cleanest abstraction. I don't like that it doesn't really follow first normal form. Generally speaking, there's almost always a different and better way to do it, or one that feels cleaner to me. But your mileage may vary, and I hope this has been a good explanation of how to construct a dynamic block and use it in a Terraform resource. Hey, if you've been enjoying these videos, and I hope you have, I would love it if you would support me on this wonderful site called Patreon. I've got 3 different tiers, and if you support me at the big burrito level, you get your name alongside some other pretty awesome people that should appear right around here right about now. So if that interests you, the link is down in the description. If that's not your deal, and I totally understand, if you just want to subscribe, that would be awesome too, or share it with a friend. I also appreciate that. And hey, I'm always looking for new topics to do for the next Terraform Tuesday. So if you can think of something that you want explained a little bit better, leave that down in the comments or contact me directly. It's Ned1313 on Twitter. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. You know, if I'm being honest, they're really not even that dynamic. I know what you mean. I've seen better. Yeah.